At the corner of Main Street in Crestwood, Ohio, where the brick sidewalk still smelled of morning dew and wood smoke, Clara Vance kept a window seat at Vance Bookkeeping. The small wooden sign outside swung gently in the autumn breeze, bearing her name in modest gold lettering. Inside, the quiet was broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock and the soft scratch of a graphite pencil against heavy cream paper. Clara preferred pencils to ink. Ink was for things set in stone, unyielding promises, final verdicts, and permanent debts. Pencil, however, allowed for human error. It honored the truth that life was a fluid, unpredictable series of adjustments. To the townspeople of Crestwood, Clara was the bedrock of order. She was 34, impeccably composed, and possessed a gaze that never blinked in the face of a chaotic ledger or a devastating tax assessment. Small business owners trusted her implicitly with their livelihoods, knowing that behind her quiet demeanor lay a mind of razor-sharp precision. Yet, beneath her carefully structured routine, her perfectly ironed cardigans, her neatly arranged receipts, and her solitary apartment overlooking the square, lay a quiet, unvoiced weight. Clara lived a life measured in double entry columns, balancing everyone else's chaos while silently carrying a deficit of her own. She was the woman who remembered everyone's deadlines, swallowed her own fatigue, and hid her deepest longings behind a veil of professional calm, enduring a solitary solitude that the town mistook for peaceful self-sufficiency. 6 years ago, the central axle of the Vance family snapped in the gravel parking lot of a local hardware store. Her father, Thomas, a man whose presence had been the quiet glue binding their household together, suffered a sudden, catastrophic heart attack, with a bag of lawn fertilizer still in his hands. In the disorienting aftermath of his funeral, as the sympathy casseroles cooled and the house grew painfully quiet, the family structure threatened to collapse entirely. That was the moment Clara instinctively crawled beneath the carriage of their lives to hold up the frame, while her mother, Carol, retreated into a fog of fragile grief, and her siblings drifted into their own self-absorbed anxieties. Clara quietly picked up the tools. She organized her grandmother Ruth's intricate medication schedules, audited the mounting pile of unpaid home maintenance bills, and quietly took over the family's complex tax filings every April without charging a single cent. She became the silent shock absorber for every financial bump, the invisible pillar keeping their world upright. Whenever an unexpected expense arose, a broken water heater, a rising property tax assessment, or a forgotten car registration, Clara's phone would chime in the middle of the workday. She never complained, nor did she demand recognition. She simply adjusted her budget, opened her desk drawer, and erased the potential panic before anyone else had to feel its sting, slowly absorbing the family's burdens until her own back began to ache under the invisible strain. To an outside observer, Clara's constant financial rescue missions might have looked like the desperate, naive actions of a doormat, but Clara was no fool, nor was she blinded by false hope. She understood the mechanics of her family better than anyone. Her willingness to pay was not an act of submission, but a deliberate transaction. It was the cost of peace. In her mind, writing a check was a small price to pay to keep the peace, to shield her fragile mother from anxiety, and to preserve the sacred memory of her father's loving home. Tucked neatly on the top shelf of her office bookcase sat a thick forest green binder, completely unknown to the rest of her family. Inside its tabbed dividers lay a meticulously documented history of Lake Arden, their beloved summer cottage. Every paid property tax receipt, every insurance policy renewal, every contractor's invoice for repairing the leaky septic tank, patching the storm-damaged roof, and replacing the rotting cedar dock was filed away in chronological order. The green binder held the physical proof of her devotion, a quiet paper trail of sacrifices made over 6 long years. It was her private sanctuary of truth, proving that while her family enjoyed the sunlit days on the lake, it was her hidden ledger that kept the roof over their heads and the taxes paid, proving that love in her quiet world was spelled in line items. Sunday dinners at her mother's house had gradually morphed into a subtle crucible of obligation. The air in the dining room always smelled of slow-cooked pot roast and heavy expectations, surrounded by dark wood paneling that seemed to absorb all genuine conversation. Around the table, as bowls of mashed potatoes were passed, a familiar chorus inevitably echoed whenever a financial hurdle was mentioned. "Clara will handle it." It was stated not with profound gratitude, but with the casual lightness of a weather forecast. The unspoken dynamic had reached a shivering crisis the previous autumn, when Clara, for the very first time in her life, set a firm boundary. When her younger brother, Julian, demanded she co-sign a heavy bank loan for a flashy new sports car he couldn't afford, Clara calmly shook her head and said, "No." The reaction was swift and punishing. Her mother did not yell or scream. Instead, she deployed a weapon far more potent in the Vance household: a 3-week cold front. Carol's phone calls became terse, her hugs turned stiff, and her tone carried a passive-aggressive chill that left Clara feeling like an outsider in her own family. The icy silence was a grueling test of endurance, designed to remind Clara that her value in the family was directly tied to her compliance, leaving her isolated in a cold, suffocating fog of guilt that lingered long after the autumn leaves had fallen. 4 years later, as late August approached, bringing with it the golden light and cool breezes, precursor to Labor Day weekend, the lingering tension in the family suddenly dissolved into a strange, fluttering optimism. 2 weeks before the holiday, cryptic messages began appearing in the family group chat. Her mother, Carol, sent a series of cheerful emojis, followed by the text, "Keep your schedule completely clear for Labor Day weekend, sweetie. Don't plan a thing, just wait and see." Her older sister, Hannah, echoed the sentiment with unusually warm promises of a long overdue celebration. Clara felt a sudden, hopeful lump form in her throat. She allowed herself to believe that perhaps, after 6 long years of quiet, heavy lifting, her family had finally noticed her exhaustion. She imagined a surprise dinner, a heartfelt toast, or perhaps a simple gesture of gratitude honoring everything she had sacrificed since her father's passing. Deeply moved by this rare display of affection, Clara immediately rearranged her professional life. She rescheduled 3 crucial consultations with high-value business clients, absorbing the financial loss without a second thought. More significantly, she surrendered her non-refundable registration ticket to a prestigious state accounting conference in Columbus, an event she had looked forward to for months. She closed her appointment book with a rare, genuine smile, convinced that her years of quiet devotion were finally being recognized, entirely unaware that the stage was being set for a devastating betrayal that would alter her life forever. On Friday evening, the atmosphere inside Carol Vance's suburban home felt deceptively serene, wrapped in the comforting, nostalgic sense of slow-cooked pot roast and warm cinnamon apples. Carol had warmly invited Clara to spend the night in her childhood bedroom, a cozy sanctuary untouched by time, complete with floral wallpaper and soft linen sheets. Throughout the evening, subtle signs flickered beneath the surface. The muffled thud of heavy suitcases being rolled behind the closed laundry room door, and whispering voices that abruptly ceased whenever Clara stepped into the kitchen. Yet, blinded by the long-cherished hope of family reconciliation, Clara ignored her sharp instincts. After dinner, her 12-year-old niece, Lily, wrapped her arms around Clara in an unusually tight, lingering hug, burying her face into Clara's sweater as if quietly apologizing for an unspoken secret. Before retiring to bed, Carol pressed a tender, affectionate kiss onto Clara's forehead, smoothing her hair with a mother's gentle touch. "Sleep well, sweetie," Carol murmured softly, her eyes glistening with a strange, unreadable emotion. "Remember, don't make any plans for tomorrow morning. Just stay put and rest." Wrapped in the familiar warmth of her old blankets, listening to the gentle rustle of oak leaves outside her window, Clara fell asleep with a peaceful heart. She cradled the sweet, naive belief that the next day would finally bring the heartfelt celebration, quiet appreciation, and genuine belonging she had spent 6 long years patiently waiting for. Clara awakened at precisely 7:40 on Saturday morning to a house steeped in an uncanny, hollow silence, broken only by the low, rhythmic hum of the kitchen refrigerator. Slipping on her cardigan, she walked down the sunlit hallway, expecting the lively clatter of coffee mugs and the cheerful sound of family morning chatter. Instead, she found the living room completely deserted, the air still and heavy with dust motes dancing in the sunlight. Resting on the polished granite kitchen island was a single sheet of yellow-lined paper, held down by a porcelain mug. Written in Carol's distinctive, fluid cursive was a detailed list of household chores, a strict schedule for administering grandmother Ruth's afternoon blood pressure medication, exact instructions for watering the backyard cherry tomato plants, and a reminder about the holiday trash collection time. There was no note of warm invitation, no explanation, and not a single word of apology for leaving her behind. The stark truth hit Clara with the icy clarity of a mountain stream. There was no surprise party waiting for her at Lake Arden, no triumphant toast honoring her years of sacrifice. She was not the cherished guest of honor in her family's holiday plans. She was simply the unpaid, reliable house sitter, left behind to guard the empty house while the rest of the world moved on without her. By noon on Saturday, as the golden autumn sun reached its peak, Clara sat alone on her mother's back porch, holding a lukewarm cup of black coffee. Instinctively, she opened Instagram on her phone, and her thumb hovered over the screen as her sister Hannah's vibrant story icon flashed at the top of her feed. Tapping the screen, Clara was immediately greeted by a burst of dazzling sunlight reflecting off the crystal-clear waters of Lake Arden. The video played in vivid detail. Her younger brother Julian laughing wildly as he performed a cannonball off the wooden dock, and her mother Carol glowing in a wide-brimmed straw hat, raising a glass of chilled rosé with a radiant, carefree smile. Scrolling to the next image, Clara's heart stopped. Across a sun-drenched photo of the family dining al fresco by the water, written in a stylish, looping script, was Hannah's caption. Best trip ever when she's not around. Lol. A quick glance at the view count revealed that 214 people had already seen the post, including dozens of aunts, uncles, and family friends who had eagerly tapped the heart icon in agreement. The public humiliation was raw, calculated, and sharp. A deliberate cruelty delivered by the very people whose peace she had spent 6 years and tens of thousands of dollars quietly protecting. In that shattering moment, something fundamental shifted deep inside Clara's spirit, freezing the warm liquid of her grief into a solid, unyielding iron. She did not cry, nor did she type out an angry, emotional text message demanding an explanation, nor did she leave a bitter comment beneath Hannah's cruelty. Clara knew from years of managing complex ledgers that impulsive anger was a high-interest loan, a temporary burst of emotional release that ultimately cost more than it gave. Instead, she chose a profound, absolute stillness. Looking down at the plastic watering can sitting by her feet, she quietly set it down against the balcony railing, deliberately choosing to leave her mother's prized cherry tomato plants unwatered in the afternoon heat. A quiet epiphany washed over her. In their short-sighted eagerness to humiliate her, her family had abandoned the sole manager of their lives. They had locked out the only person who held the master passwords, the insurance policy numbers, the maintenance schedules, and the financial keys to their comfortable existence. She was no longer their helpless victim. She was the architect of their stability, and she was officially stepping away from the drafting table. The silent, peaceful resolve settled over her shoulders like a heavy winter coat, replacing her lingering heartache with a cool, sharp clarity that she had never known before. Clara quietly turned the heavy brass key in her mother's front door, locking it firmly behind her, and walked toward her car parked in the driveway. She drove 5 miles across town to Cedar Street, pulling up to a modest, white-frame house with a neat porch and blooming marigolds. This was the home of her 83-year-old grandmother, Ruth Vance, a sharp-witted former public school teacher who had also been quietly left off the family's holiday guest list for being too slow and burdensome to travel with. When Clara opened the front door, she found Ruth sitting at the kitchen table in her favorite floral apron, humming a soft tune to the radio. Sensing the heavy, quiet energy radiating from her granddaughter, the old woman set down her teacup and looked into Clara's eyes with a gaze filled with decades of earned wisdom and deep empathy. Without asking a single question about the family or demanding an explanation for Clara's unexpected arrival, Ruth stood up, patted the wooden counter, and motioned toward the refrigerator. "Come in here and crack a few eggs, sweetheart," Ruth said softly, her voice carrying the warm, steady anchor of absolute, unconditional love. "We are going to make us a proper breakfast, and then we are going to talk about how you are finally going to take your life back." Mrs. Ruth rocked gently on the porch, her voice carrying the quiet, weather-worn wisdom of someone who had watched decades of human folly drift by like autumn leaves. She recounted Carol's unexpected visit on Thursday, recalling how Clara's mother had marched up the steps carrying aluminum food trays alongside a stiff, dark leather pouch she always called her church briefcase. Mrs. Ruth paused, setting her teacup down with a faint clink, her milky blue eyes holding an undeniable sharpness. "Nobody carries administrative paperwork to go for a swim, Clara," the old woman murmured, her tone devoid of malice, yet rich with unyielding clarity. She leaned closer, her wrinkled hands resting over her knee, bringing back a phrase that had lingered in Clara's mind like an unhealed bruise. "They packed up and took the boat keys this morning, didn't they?" It's funny, isn't it? How nobody ever thinks to ask who's paying the electric bill to keep the porch lights on at night. The words hung in the warm afternoon air, heavy with unspoken truths. In Mrs. Ruth's gentle observation lay a profound recognition of Clara's quiet sacrifices, the invisible labor of maintaining a refuge for people who only cared to enjoy the warmth without ever honoring the flame. It was a strange kind of comfort, receiving validation from an outsider when her own blood had spent years treating her stewardship as an inconvenience. Clara felt a subtle shift within her chest, a quiet settling of dust where resentment had once burned, realizing that her light had never truly gone unseen. Seeking solace in routine, Clara picked up Mrs. Buchap, Ruth's aging iPad, to clear out fragmented cache memory and junk files before the old woman's scheduled telehealth consultation later that afternoon. The tablet was an old device, still tied to a legacy Apple ID account that Clara had originally configured years ago for her sister Hannah. Clara's mind, shaped by a decade of rigorous data analytics, moved instinctively through system diagnostics, navigating through layered file paths and cloud sync settings with quiet, effortless precision. That was when her eyes caught a small, lingering artifact in the background notification stream. A subtle ghost in the system. Gary Sutton, realtor. Cottage, 11 a.m., Monday. A cold, familiar stillness settled over Clara's hands. Instead of pulling back in shock, her analytical instincts took over, stripping away emotion to systematically trace the digital data trail to its source. She initiated a full cloud backup restoration, digging past surface-level folders until she unearthed a hidden messaging archive. There, lurking beneath innocuous family photos, was an encrypted group chat titled Cottage Crew, initialized back in May. As the chat history populated her screen, line by line, Clara stood motionless amidst the quiet hum of the living room. The digital evidence was unmistakable, organized with deliberate intent, documenting months of coordinated planning. Where others might have seen mere text on a screen, Clara's trained eye saw a structural blueprint of isolation, a secret architecture constructed entirely behind her back by the very people she had spent her life trying to protect, balance, and sustain. Scrolling through the archive, Clara watched 3 months of family summer plans unfold, a parallel reality where her existence was systematically edited out. She paused at a message exchange from mid-July, sent by her young niece, Lily. "Is Aunt Clara coming with us?" The response from her mother, Carol, was instant and devastating in its nonchalant efficiency. "Not this time, sweetie. She'll do the math out loud." Clara stared at the glowing text, those 7 short words echoing in the silence like a verdict handed down without a trial. In that single offhand remark, her mother had laid bare the true nature of Clara's perceived offense. It was never that Clara was difficult, cold, or heartless, as they so often whispered at holiday dinners. Her unpardonable sin was her unyielding commitment to truth. She was the one who looked at reality without flinching, who measured real costs, and who refused to participate in the comfortable delusions that kept the family afloat. They banished her not because she lacked love, but because her clarity threatened the fragile, beautiful lies they used to justify their entitlement. Reading her mother's words did not shatter Clara's heart. Instead, it offered a strange, luminous gift of ultimate absolution. The heavy fog of self-doubt that had shadowed her for years suddenly lifted, revealing that her precision was never an emotional flaw to be cured, but a shield of integrity. She was not the bitter villain in their story. She was simply the witness they could not afford to keep around. Further down the thread, Clara discovered an attached document titled Chore Family Budget V3. It was a custom spreadsheet template she herself had meticulously built and designed for her mother years ago, complete with color-coded formulas and auto-calculating totals. A subtle, bitter irony settled in as she saw how they had weaponized her own painstaking labor against her, using her formulaic grid to split gasoline expenses, tally trip groceries, and budget a lavish catering lunch for the realtor, Gary Sutton. The raw, unvarnished truth was now fully laid open before her eyes. They had scheduled Sutton to conduct an official on-site valuation of the beloved lake cottage on Monday morning, with the urgent intent of putting the family property on the market immediately. The anticipated proceeds from the sale were secretly earmarked to cover a steep $60,000 franchise deposit for her younger brother Julian's new gym venture, a non-negotiable deadline looming large on Friday. They were actively preparing to sell the sacred sanctuary that had anchored their family for generations, liquidating a physical legacy to fund another one of Julian's reckless shortcuts, all while deliberately keeping Clara in the dark so she couldn't intervene. Yet, as the full scope of their conspiracy came into focus, Clara felt no paralyzing wave of panic or despair. The shocking realization brought a quiet, grounding tranquility. Her family saw the cottage as quick capital, but Clara knew every nail, every plank, and every dollar that held it upright. They were counting on her silence, completely unaware that the real power of the numbers had always belonged to her. Returning to her quiet apartment, Clara pulled out a worn, blue cloth-bound notebook and laid it flat on her wooden dining table. She slowly flipped through pages filled with her own neat handwriting, an unbroken testament to 6 years of silent devotion. Every line item was recorded with exacting care. Property taxes at $3,900 per year across 6 full years. Annual home insurance premiums of $1,650. $7,200 for the emergency septic system overhaul. $4,800 to repair the storm-damaged roof. $2,300 for reinforced dock pilings. And $3,100 to install a new high-efficiency furnace during a freezing winter. At the bottom of the final page, written in steady, clear pencil, was the cumulative sum: $61,400. Clara recalled a line her mother had callously typed in the group chat earlier. That house does nothing but cost money. Sitting in the warm glow of her dining room lamp, Clara lightly traced the graphite total with her index finger and softly whispered into the quiet room, "It costs money. It just never cost you a single cent." The words carried no bitter anger, only the indisputable weight of absolute truth. In that quiet moment, the long burden of her unacknowledged sacrifice transformed into profound personal freedom. The notebook was no longer a heavy record of debt or underappreciated labor. It was her ultimate declaration of independence. She finally understood that while they had stolen the boat keys, she held the master ledger. Clara closed the blue cover with a soft, decisive click, ready to step fully into the light of her own undeniable worth. On a crisp Sunday morning, as sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains of the kitchen, Aunt Ruth poured 2 cups of black coffee and revealed a truth long buried in silence. 8 years ago, in the fragile months following his sudden, terrifying heart attack on the cellar stairs, Clara's father had driven alone to the county land registry office. He was a man of few words, but his quiet foresight had written a subtle shield over his daughter's future. He quietly restructured the house's deed into a joint tenancy with right of survivorship, explicitly binding the property's destiny between himself and Clara. Aunt Ruth placed the aged, crisp document on the wooden table between them. When he passed away 3 years later, full ownership of the Victorian home automatically transferred entirely to Clara, bypassing the sprawling, contentious labyrinth of probate court altogether. It meant that legally, not an inch of the floorboards belonged to anyone else, nor could it be carved up by family consensus. Sitting there, watching the steam rise into the morning air, Clara felt a sudden, profound shift in the atmosphere around her. The house was not a battlefield where she had to beg for a place to stand. It was a sanctuary her father had already fortified for her with his silent, enduring love. Aunt Ruth looked out toward the sunlit garden, her eyes carrying the heavy weight of remembered history as she began to speak of Clara's mother, Carol. At 23, bright-eyed and brimming with unfulfilled dreams, Carol had been bound to her own bedridden mother for 7 long, exhausting years, while her 2 older sisters fled town to build prosperous, unfettered lives elsewhere. Carol's sacrifice was never honored as a gift. It was cold-bloodedly demanded as an unwritten, non-negotiable duty. "Your mother drowned in these exact waters," Aunt Ruth said, her voice dropping into a low, steady cadence that hit Clara right in the chest. "Instead of draining the river, she taught you how to swim in it and called it love. Understanding the source of the river won't keep you dry, Clara, but it will make your hands steady when you take the oars." The quiet wisdom settled into the room, gently dissolving Clara's lingering, toxic guilt. She realized her mother's relentless demands were not a measure of Clara's worth, but merely the phantom echoes of an unhealed trauma passed down through generations. Clara didn't have to drown just to prove she belonged to the shore. By Sunday night, while her family gathered on the polished porch of their rented beach house to finalize their eager plans for selling the property, Clara sat alone in her dim apartment before her glowing computer screen. She chose not to engage in their chaotic group text or plead for basic understanding. Instead, at exactly 21:12, she drafted a firm, icy clear email attached with a formal legal notice to the main office of Sutton Realty. The document formally declared her undisputed 100% sole ownership of the address, stated categorically that the house was not for sale under any circumstances, and explicitly warned of immediate, severe legal action and a formal complaint to the National Association of Realtors if Gary Sutton set foot on the grass again. Hit send. The quiet keystroke felt like a tectonic shift beneath her feet. Simple, yet utterly absolute. She wasn't throwing an emotional tantrum. She was simply placing a heavy, unbreakable iron lock on her own life. For the very first time, she wasn't asking for permission to occupy her own space. She was simply, quietly, enforcing the law of her own boundary. Monday morning dawned bathed in gold, and Clara spent it walking through the bustling open-air market alongside Aunt Ruth, smelling sweet summer peaches and buying fresh wildflowers, fully present in the calm beauty of the world. At 11:04 a.m., her phone began to light up on the cafe table like a frantic neon sign. The legal knockout blow had landed hard at the beach house. Gary Sutton's personal corporate attorney had called him in a panic, threatening to drop his firm if he engaged in unauthorized property deals. Terrified of a ruined reputation, Gary canceled his meeting within 10 minutes and fled the resort. Back at the beach house, total chaos erupted. Clara's screen showed 63 missed calls and an endless stream of frantic text notifications from her mother, Julian, Hannah, and Josh. Their carefully constructed narrative of entitlement had shattered against the cold wall of legal reality. Yet, sitting under the shade of a market umbrella, drinking fresh lemonade, Clara felt an uncanny sense of peace. The storm was raging wildly on the other side of the glass, but inside her chest, the air was entirely still. On a crisp Sunday morning, as sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains of the kitchen, Aunt Ruth poured 2 cups of black coffee and revealed a truth long buried in silence. 8 years ago, In the fragile months following his sudden, terrifying heart attack on the cellar stairs, Clara's father had driven alone to the county land registry office. He was a man of few words, but his quiet foresight had written a subtle shield over his daughter's future. He quietly restructured the house's deed into a joint tenancy with right of survivorship, explicitly binding the property's destiny between himself and Clara. Aunt Ruth placed the aged, crisp document on the wooden table between them. When he passed away 3 years later, full ownership of the Victorian home automatically transferred entirely to Clara, bypassing the sprawling, contentious labyrinth of probate court altogether. It meant that legally, not an inch of the floorboards belonged to anyone else, nor could it be carved up by family consensus. Sitting there, watching the steam rise into the morning air, Clara felt a sudden, profound shift in the atmosphere around her. The house was not a battlefield where she had to beg for a place to stand. It was a sanctuary her father had already fortified for her, with his silent, enduring love. Aunt Ruth looked out toward the sunlit garden, her eyes carrying the heavy weight of remembered history as she began to speak of Clara's mother, Carol. At 23, bright-eyed and brimming with unfulfilled dreams, Carol had been bound to her own bedridden mother for 7 long, exhausting years, while her 2 older sisters fled town to build prosperous, unfettered lives elsewhere. Carol's sacrifice was never honored as a gift. It was cold-bloodedly demanded as an unwritten, non-negotiable duty. Your mother drowned in these exact waters, Aunt Ruth said, her voice dropping into a low, steady cadence that hit Clara right in the chest. Instead of draining the river, she taught you how to swim in it and called it love. Understanding the source of the river won't keep you dry, Clara, but it will make your hands steady when you take the oars. The quiet wisdom settled into the room, gently dissolving Clara's lingering, toxic guilt. She realized her mother's relentless demands were not a measure of Clara's worth, but merely the phantom echoes of an unhealed trauma passed down through generations. Clara didn't have to drown just to prove she belonged to the shore. By Sunday night, while her family gathered on the polished porch of their rented beach house to finalize their eager plans for selling the property, Clara sat alone in her dim apartment before her glowing computer screen. She chose not to engage in their chaotic group text or plead for basic understanding. Instead, at exactly 21:12, she drafted a firm, icy clear email attached with a formal legal notice to the main office of Sutton Realty. The document formally declared her undisputed 100% sole ownership of the address, stated categorically that the house was not for sale under any circumstances, and explicitly warned of immediate, severe legal action and a formal complaint to the National Association of Realtors if Gary Sutton set foot on the grass again. Hit send. The quiet keystroke felt like a tectonic shift beneath her feet. Simple, yet utterly absolute. She wasn't throwing an emotional tantrum. She was simply placing a heavy, unbreakable iron lock on her own life. For the very first time, she wasn't asking for permission to occupy her own space. She was simply, quietly, enforcing the law of her own boundary. Monday morning dawned, bathed in gold, and Clara spent it walking through the bustling open-air market alongside Aunt Ruth, smelling sweet summer peaches and buying fresh wildflowers, fully present in the calm beauty of the world. At 11:04 a.m., her phone began to light up on the cafe table, like a frantic neon sign. The legal knockout blow had landed hard at the beach house. Gary Sutton's personal corporate attorney had called him in a panic, threatening to drop his firm if he engaged in unauthorized property deals. Terrified of a ruined reputation, Gary canceled his meeting within 10 minutes and fled the resort. Back at the beach house, total chaos erupted. Clara's screen showed 63 missed calls and an endless stream of frantic text notifications from her mother, Julian, Hannah, and Josh. Their carefully constructed narrative of entitlement had shattered against the cold wall of legal reality. Yet, sitting under the shade of a market umbrella, drinking fresh lemonade, Clara felt an uncanny sense of peace. The storm was raging wildly on the other side of the glass. But inside her chest, the air was entirely still. By afternoon, the digital storm began to lose its furious momentum. Hannah quietly deleted her grandiose Instagram story about the house remodel, scrubbing her online presence clean. Her mother left a final, trembling voicemail at 11:58 p.m. Her voice stripped of its usual razor-sharp authority, whispering, "Please come home, Clara. We didn't know." Clara listened to the cascading messages with the emotional detachment of an auditor inspecting old receipts. No lingering anger, no surge of triumph, just clarity. The only message she actually opened and chose to answer came from her 8-year-old niece, Lily, sent from a hidden corner of the beach house. "Auntie Clara, why is everyone screaming at each other?" Clara's fingers softened over the keys as a warm, protective tenderness washed away the last traces of bitterness. She typed back a simple, reassuring truth that anchored them both in the storm. "Everything is going to be all right, sweetheart. Go to sleep." She closed her phone, set it face down on the nightstand, and breathed in the quiet, undisturbed night. On Tuesday afternoon, the quiet tranquility of Vance bookkeeping was shattered when Julian burst through the front door, his face flushed with unbridled rage as he kicked a heavy metal wastebasket across the hardwood floor. He stood over Clara's pristine desk, shouting that family meant shared money and mutual survival, loudly accusing her of betraying her own blood for selfish corporate greed. Clara slowly set down her graphite pencil, looked him dead in the eye, and replied with absolute composure. "That is a fascinating philosophy, Julian, but it is strange how not a single person in this family has ever contributed a single penny to that shared pool." Later that evening, her older sister Hannah arrived at Clara's apartment, carrying a hot glass dish of homemade lasagna. Her head bowed in profound shame. Sitting at the kitchen counter, Hannah broke down and confessed the dark truth. Carol had been systematically deceiving the entire family since early June, telling everyone that Clara had repeatedly declined the Labor Day lake invitation because she was too busy, bitter, and arrogant to join them. Their mother had meticulously crafted two entirely different narratives, telling the family that Clara didn't care about them, while telling Clara that she wasn't wanted at the cottage. Listening to her sister's tearful admission, Clara felt no surge of explosive anger, only a deep, settling clarity. The invisible web of emotional manipulation was finally unraveling, and for the first time in 6 long years, the truth was stepping out from behind the shadows into the clear light of day. On Wednesday morning, Clara typed a single, unyielding message into the family group chat. 7 p.m. tonight. Mother's living room. I will bring the documents. She offered no further explanations, no room for negotiation, and no emotional commentary. Spending her afternoon at the local print shop, Clara compiled and photocopied 5 identical, professionally bound dossiers containing every single page from her forest green binder. Every real estate tax statement, hazard insurance policy renewal, contractor invoice, and canceled bank check from the past 6 years was systematically organized, labeled, and time-stamped. To ensure that the truth remained unsullied by emotional gaslighting, dramatic tantrums, or historical revisionism, Clara drove across town to collect Grandma Ruth, asking the sharp-witted matriarch to stand beside her as an impartial witness to justice. Ruth took her seat in the passenger side with a proud, serene smile, patting Clara's knee with steadying warmth. Together, they drove toward Carol's suburban house, carrying the unshakable weight of cold, hard evidence. Clara knew this evening was not about launching a spiteful attack or seeking bitter revenge against her mother. It was a profound act of self-respect, deep inner healing, and dynamic liberation. She was preparing to lay down a sacred boundary that would forever redefine her place within the family circle, replacing years of silent, unspoken martyrdom with the unassailable authority of absolute truth, personal dignity, personal peace, and financial reality. At precisely 7 p.m. on Wednesday, the family gathered in Carol's dark-paneled living room. An untouched lemon meringue pie sat awkwardly on the coffee table, surrounded by a heavy, suffocating silence that felt like the quiet before a devastating thunderstorm. Clara walked into the room with steady grace, holding 5 heavy white folders under her arm, accompanied by Grandma Ruth, who quietly took a chair by the fireplace. Without speaking a single word, Clara distributed a folder to Carol, Hannah, Julian, and Josh, before placing her original forest green binder squarely on the center table. She opened her notebook and began to read aloud, her voice carrying the cool, precise cadence of a seasoned auditor addressing a courtroom. Line by line, she itemized 6 years of buried sacrifices, real estate taxes, structural insurance premiums, emergency septic tank overhauls, major roof repairs, cedar dock pilings, and new high-efficiency heating system replacements. As her voice gently delivered the grand cumulative sum, $61,400, the air in the room seemed to vanish entirely. Julian stared at his open folder in stunned disbelief. Hannah's mouth hung open in absolute silence, and Josh shifted uncomfortably in his armchair. The sheer numerical magnitude of Clara's silent devotion echoed off the walls, leaving no room for denial, excuses, or emotional manipulation. The invisible foundation that had kept their lives comfortable for 6 long years was finally brought into the blinding light, exposing the staggering emotional and financial debt they owed to her quiet grace. Bursting into dramatic tears, Carol clutched her lace handkerchief and tried to hide behind a shield of maternal grief and fragile pride. "I am a poor widow, Clara," Carol sobbed, her voice trembling with theatrical performance. "I was only trying to preserve our family's honor. I never knew you paid so much money. I had no idea." Clara did not flinch, nor did she allow the tearful spectacle to derail the truth. With surgical precision, she reached into her binder, pulled out a laminated piece of paper, and extended it across the table directly in front of her mother's face. It was a printed screenshot of an old text message thread dated October 12th, 4 years prior. Clara pointed her finger at the black and white text and asked in a quiet, piercing tone, "You had no idea, Mother? Then what is this message from October 12th where you wrote, 'Clara, the roof contractor is demanding $4,800 today, or he will put a lien on the cottage. Please wire the money right now.'" Carol's crying stopped instantly, her face turning pale as her theatrical mask was unceremoniously stripped away. The room fell into an absolute haunting quiet as Hannah and Julian stared at their mother in deep shock. Carol's lifelong illusion of helpless ignorance collapsed completely under the weight of her own written words, revealing the calculating dishonesty that had fueled her manipulative control over their lives for years. Breaking the suffocating silence, Hannah stammered an offer to sell the lake house immediately, to reimburse Clara every single penny of the $61,400. Panicking at the thought of losing control, Carol reached across the table, desperately grasping Clara's hands and pleading with her to step up and officially take over as the new head of the family. Clara slowly, deliberately pulled her hands back, reclaiming her personal space, her emotional autonomy, and her dignity. She looked at her family with calm, unshakable strength and issued her final declaration of independence. The cottage would not be sold, but her days of funding their lives in secret were officially over. Moving forward, every property expense would be split equally, in writing, and Julian would not receive a single dollar for his risky gym loan. Then, looking directly into her mother's eyes, Clara delivered the ultimate emotional climax of her life. "I never wanted to own or rule this family, Mother. I just wanted to be a part of it. I am your daughter, but I was never and will never be an employee of this house." The profound words hung in the air, radiating healing, truth, and ultimate freedom. Clara stood up, took Grandma Ruth's arm, and walked out into the cool evening air, leaving her past behind and stepping triumphantly into her bright, unburdened future. Julian's boot hit the heavy oak table leg with a dull, resonant thud, a desperate, violent outburst that splintered the silence and sealed the forfeiture of his long-sought gym franchise. Hannah caught his trembling arm, leading her defeated husband toward the driveway as his low curses vanished into the September night. Amidst the lingering static of shattered expectations, small footsteps pattered across the hardwood. Lily, her eyes wide with a quiet, uncanny intelligence, threw her arms around Clara's waist, burying her face in the crisp linen of her aunt's shirt. "Grandma Ruth said you would stand tall tonight," the young girl whispered, her voice a steady anchor against the evening's chaos. "She told me to watch you and learn." As Clara stepped off the porch of her childhood home, the cool, autumn-tinged air rushed into her lungs like an unspoken blessing. The heavy, iron chain of obligation that had bound her collarbone for decades suddenly snapped, dissolving into the darkness. She did not drive away in anger. She drove away in clarity. The house behind her remained filled with decades of unspoken grief and tangled codependency. But for the first time in 35 years, Clara felt entirely weightless. The night was vast, untamed, and entirely hers, stretching out before her headlights like a blank canvas, waiting for its true lines to be drawn. There was no fairy tale reconciliation waiting around the corner, no tearful family dynamic miraculously healed overnight. Julian severed all communication, his pride too deeply wounded to forgive the boundaries that had denied him a free ride. Hannah sent brief, polite text messages that tiptoed around the periphery of real emotion, maintaining a quiet, cautious distance. Yet, reform arrived in subtle, unvarnished strokes. A month later, Carol walked into Clara's bright accounting office carrying a worn canvas tote bag overflowing with utility bills and crumpled receipts. "Teach me how to read this ledger," her mother said softly, her voice lacking its usual tragic theatricality. Carol had quietly taken a part-time job at the local fabric store, her delicate hands now working rolls of cotton and measuring tape. At the end of that first month, she slipped a crisp $200 money order across Clara's desk. Clara accepted the paper without grand ceremony or emotional flair. She took the money not out of financial need, but because she understood the profound dignity embedded within accountability. By allowing her mother to pay her own way, Clara was finally granting Carol the one thing the family had always denied her: the respect of treating her as a capable, self-governing adult who could bear the weight of her own life. Every Friday afternoon, as the golden hours faded, Lily's school bus would idle at the corner, dropping the young girl off directly at Clara's office. They instituted a sacred weekly routine they called allowance math, sitting side by side at the large mahogany desk littered with colored pencils and ledger pads. Clara didn't just teach her niece how to balance simple addition and subtraction. She carefully dismantled the generational blueprint that had conditioned the women in their family for decades. She taught Lily that money was not a guilt trip, a weapon of control, or a substitute for love, but rather a quiet, reliable tool for personal sovereignty. They calculated savings, mapped out hypothetical investments, and analyzed the true cost of emotional promises. You never bend your spine to keep a roof over your head that isn't yours, Lily, Clara would explain, watching the young girl thoughtfully trace rows of balanced numbers. In those quiet Friday afternoons, Clara was doing the sacred work of generational repair. She was systematically untangling the invisible wires of the doormat cycle that had trapped her mother and eroded her own youth. She was building a fortress inside this young girl's mind, a sacred space where self-worth would never again be traded for conditional approval. A year later, the first light of Labor Day bled across the glass surface of Lake Arden, painting the dark pines in shades of amber and rose. Clara stood at the end of the wooden dock her father had built decades ago, a steaming mug of black coffee cradled in her hands, listening to the soft lap of water against the cedar pilings. On the porch, Grandma Ruth sat wrapped in a thick wool blanket, her sharp eyes watching Lily practice cannonballs off the dock with fearless, splashy enthusiasm. Presently, a car gravelly crunched up the driveway. Hannah and Carol emerged carrying large glass bowls of potato salad for the afternoon cookout. This time, however, there were no implicit demands or unspoken resentments hanging in the damp morning air. The weekend had been arranged under a clear, written cost-sharing agreement that everyone had signed weeks prior. Transparent, equitable, and completely free of martyr complex. There were no hushed, bitter whispers behind closed kitchen doors, no desperate attempts to fix what was broken, and no performative sacrifices. The boundary had not destroyed the family. It had simply re-anchored it. The structure was lighter, cooler, and built on the solid ground of mutual respect rather than the suffocating quicksand of unspoken expectations. As a sudden, warm summer shower began to tap gently against the lake's surface, Carol stood quietly under the awning, watching Clara turn the marinated chicken on the sizzling iron grill. There was an unspoken tenderness in her mother's gaze, a quiet realization that her daughter had survived the furnace of their shared history. Flipping the coals, Clara felt the final, profound truth of her journey settle deep into her bones. Being needed is not the same as being loved. The day a woman realizes that vital distinction is the exact day she stops serving as a passive piece of furniture in someone else's home and steps fully into her power as the author of her own life. She is no longer defined by the burdens she carries for others, but by the space she creates for her own soul to breathe. The afternoon rain swept across Lake Arden, washing away the dust of old regrets and leaving the summer air sweet and extraordinarily clear. On the wooden table inside the cabin lay Clara's old pencil ledger, its worn leather cover resting open to a completely fresh, unwritten white page, pristine and waiting under the soft, emerging sunlight.